We know what you did. You have no proof. We have witnesses.
This is a mistake!
We're innocent. Is there a problem here? This is outrageous. She needs help.
Please, I don't understand.
Where is it? I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me! I'm not! You can't do this! Let go of me now!
Please, stop
Please,
this!
son, he listens! This is assault! You can't do this! Take your hands off me!
Please, stop this!
Back off! You have to unlock us, officer. What's the problem here? No time! They're coming!
Officer, please!
All right, step back.
The winter air in Harlem carried a certain kind of silence that only people who had lived there long enough could recognize. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the pause before something meaningful unfolded. Streets buzzed with life during the day, but at night, Harlem spoke in whispers, glances, and unspoken rules. Everyone knew where they stood, and more importantly, who deserved respect. At the center of this world stood Bumpy Johnson, a man whose name alone carried weight, not because he shouted it, but because he never had to. Bumpy was not loud. He wasn't reckless. He understood that true power didn't come from fists or threats. It came from presence, discipline, and the ability to remain calm when others lost control. He had learned that lesson long before most men learned how to shave. But this story does not begin with him. It begins with his wife. She was a woman of quiet elegance, someone who walked through Harlem with her head held high, not of arrogance, but out of self-respect. She dressed modestly, spoke softly, and carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew exactly who she was. People didn't step aside for her because of fear. They did so because of respect. She represented something rare in that era, grace without weakness. On that particular morning, she stepped out of their apartment to run simple errands: bread, milk, a short walk that should have been uneventful. Harlem women did this every day. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, but power often attracts envy, and envy often wears a uniform. Across the street, a police car slowed down. Inside sat a police officer who had recently been transferred into the neighborhood. He was young, inexperienced, and dangerously confident. He didn't understand Harlem. He didn't understand its people, and he definitely didn't understand the invisible lines you never crossed. He saw her, not as a woman, not as someone's wife, not as a human being deserving respect. He saw an opportunity to feel powerful. He stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with forced authority. His smile wasn't friendly, it was sharp, arrogant, and careless, the kind of smile worn by someone who believed their badge made them untouchable. "Hey," he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness, "walking alone today?" She stopped, slowly, calmly. She turned to face him, her expression composed, her voice steady. "Yes," she replied. "Is there a problem, officer?" That should have been the end of it. But men who lack character often mistake politeness for weakness. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel invasive. He made a remark, an unnecessary one, disrespectful, insulting, not loud enough to cause a scene, but sharp enough to wound dignity. His smile widened, expecting fear, maybe embarrassment. He got neither. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult him back. She didn't threaten him with her husband's name. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, and said calmly, "You should be careful with how you speak to people." The officer laughed, a short, dismissive laugh, the kind that said, "I don't take you seriously." He waved her off and returned to his car, still smiling, convinced he had just reminded someone of their place. What he didn't realize was this: Harlem had seen many men like him, and none of them smiled for long. When she returned home, she said nothing at first, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something deeper. She knew her husband, she knew his nature, and she knew that anger, once released, could not be recalled. Later that evening, as they sat together at the small dining table, she mentioned it, briefly, without drama. Her tone wasn't emotional. There were no tears, just facts. "A policeman spoke to me today." Bumpy looked up. Not alarmed, not angry, just attentive. He was disrespectful. That was all she needed to say. Bumpy didn't slam the table, he didn't curse, he didn't ask for names or threaten revenge. He simply nodded, as if filing the information away in a place only he could access. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then returned to his meal. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like nothing had happened, but those who truly understood Bumpy Johnson knew something important. When he went quiet, the world around him usually changed. That night, Harlem slept as it always did, uneasy, watchful, alive. Somewhere, a young police officer slept comfortably, confident in his authority, unaware that he had crossed a line that didn't exist on any map or law book. He had insulted a woman, but more than that, he had insulted dignity, and in Harlem, dignity was never ignored.
The following days in Harlem moved forward like they always did, but something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, the way air pressure changes before a storm that only a few can sense. Bumpy Johnson did not change his routine, and that was precisely what unsettled the people who truly understood him. He still woke early, still dressed neatly, still spoke with the same calm precision, and still walked the streets with the unhurried confidence of a man who never needed to prove anything. Yet behind that calm lived a patience that was not passive, a patience sharpened by years of understanding how power truly worked. Harlem noticed before anyone else did. Shop owners lowered their voices when Bumpy passed, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because they knew when a man like him became quiet, it meant he was listening more than ever. Conversations paused, glances lingered, and unspoken questions floated through the neighborhood like smoke. No one asked him what he planned to do, because no one dared to assume he planned anything reckless at all. Bumpy had built his reputation not on sudden reactions, but on long memory and deliberate timing, and that made him far more dangerous to arrogance than rage ever could. Meanwhile, the police officer continued his patrols, still wearing the same confident smile, still unaware that the laughter he carried so lightly had already expired. He told the story casually to another officer, framing it as a harmless interaction, exaggerating his authority and minimizing the woman's dignity, because men like him needed approval from others to feel important. What he didn't understand was that words had weight in Harlem, and careless ones traveled faster than truth ever needed to. By the end of the week, people who had never met him knew exactly who he was and what he had said, not because they spread gossip, but because Harlem remembered disrespect the way other places remembered headlines. Bumpy did not confront the officer, and he did not send anyone else to do it for him. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He allowed the man to exist in his own ignorance. Bumpy spoke quietly with community leaders, with business owners, with men who held influence not through intimidation, but through trust. And he reminded them of something Harlem had always believed, even before it learned to articulate it clearly, that authority without respect eventually collapses under its own weight. These conversations were not instructions or threats. They were reminders, spoken gently, about the kind of neighborhood Harlem chose to be and the kind of behavior it refused to normalize. The officer began to feel it before he understood it. Doors that once opened politely now closed faster. Storekeepers who used to greet him with forced smiles became neutral, distant, careful. Children stopped waving. People answered his questions with short, respectful responses that offered nothing extra.
It was not hostility, and that confused him more than anger would have, because anger gave him something to push against, while silence left him alone with his own reflection. He began to sense that his badge was no longer enough to command warmth, and that unsettled him deeply. At home, Bumpy's wife continued her days with the same dignity as before, but there was a quiet strength in her movements now, an understanding that her composure had already done more than any confrontation ever could. She had not raised her voice, had not defended herself with a name or a threat, and yet the ripple of that moment continued to spread. Bumpy noticed this, and it reinforced what he had always believed, that true influence often came from restraint, not reaction, and that respect, once violated, demanded accountability, not chaos. The officer eventually reported feeling uncomfortable in Harlem, framing it as an environment problem rather than a personal one, because accountability rarely comes easily to those who believe authority protects them from reflection. He complained about lack of cooperation, about the coldness in the streets, about a sense that people were watching him even when they weren't. What he failed to recognize was that Harlem was not watching him anymore. It had already judged him, quietly and conclusively, and moved on. Bumpy remained patient throughout it all, not because he lacked the ability to act, but because he understood something far more important than action, that consequences feel heavier when they arrive without force. He believed that lessons learned through realization lasted longer than those learned through fear, and he allowed the officer the space to learn his own lesson, even if it came slowly and uncomfortably. This was not mercy born of weakness, but discipline born of wisdom, and it reflected a code Bumpy had followed his entire life, that power should correct, not humiliate, and that dignity, once challenged, must be defended in a way that preserves its meaning. By the end of the month, the officer requested a transfer, citing stress, lack of community support, and an environment he claimed was unmanageable. He never connected his decision to that single moment, to that careless smile, to that quiet woman who had met his disrespect with calm warning instead of fear. He left Harlem believing the neighborhood was difficult, never realizing the truth, that Harlem had simply refused to accept what he represented. And somewhere in that understanding lay the real consequence, because the officer did not lose his badge through confrontation or scandal, but he lost something far more permanent, the illusion that authority alone could command respect. Bumpy never spoke to him, never confronted him, never even acknowledged him again, because the lesson had already been delivered in the most powerful way possible, through silence, through dignity, and through a community that chose values over intimidation. Harlem exhaled quietly after that, not in celebration, but in resolution, because the balance had been restored without spectacle, and the neighborhood had proven once again that its strength did not come from noise, but from unity, memory, and an unbreakable sense of self-respect.
Time has a way of revealing truths that force never can, and in Harlem, time moved with a memory longer than most people realized. Weeks passed after the officer's departure, and life returned to its familiar rhythm, yet the story did not fade the way ordinary incidents often do. It lingered, not as gossip, but as a lesson, passed quietly from one conversation to another, reshaped each time by the values of the people who told it. What remained constant was not the man who left, but the woman who stood firm, and the man who chose restraint over reaction, because Harlem understood that true strength was measured not by what you could do, but by what you chose not to do. Bumpy Johnson never addressed the incident publicly, and that silence spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Younger men who looked up to him noticed this more than anything else, because they expected anger, confrontation, or at least a visible response. Instead, they saw discipline. They saw a man who understood that power lost its meaning the moment it became emotional. In private conversations, when asked why he let the matter resolve the way it did, Bumpy did not speak in riddles or threats. He spoke about dignity, about how respect demanded consistency, and about how a man who truly controlled himself could influence an entire environment without lifting his voice. His wife, meanwhile, became something of a quiet symbol in the neighborhood, not because she sought attention, but because her composure had changed the way people thought about strength. Women spoke about her in tones of admiration, not for what she endured, but for how she responded, and mothers used her example when teaching their daughters that self-respect did not require confrontation to be effective. She had not allowed herself to be reduced by a careless moment, and in doing so, she had elevated the standard for how disrespect was met in Harlem, not with fear, but with calm certainty. The community itself absorbed the lesson deeply. Shopkeepers became more confident in setting boundaries. Elders felt reaffirmed in the values they had tried to pass down for decades. Even local officials became more careful, more aware that Harlem was not a place where authority went unquestioned, but where character mattered just as much as position. This shift did not come from rebellion or protest. It came from collective agreement, from a shared understanding that dignity was non-negotiable and that anyone who violated it would find themselves isolated rather than opposed. Bumpy observed all of this quietly, never claiming credit, never positioning himself as the architect of the outcome, because he believed that influence lost its purity when it demanded recognition. To him, the most successful outcomes were the ones where people believed they had chosen the right path themselves. He often reflected on how easily the situation could have escalated if handled differently, how one emotional response could have undone years of careful balance, and how restraint had protected not only his family, but the entire neighborhood from unnecessary consequences. As time went on, the story evolved beyond the original moment. It became less about an officer's mistake and more about a community's response. It reminded people that power structures were not as unchangeable as they appeared, that behavior had consequences, even when the law did not immediately intervene, and that unity, when grounded in shared values, could correct injustice without chaos. This realization strengthened Harlem's identity, reinforcing its belief that respect was not something granted by titles or uniforms, but earned through conduct. For Bumpy, the incident reaffirmed a philosophy he had carried his entire life, that leadership was not about control, but about stewardship, about protecting the dignity of those around you, even when doing so required patience instead of pride. He understood that moments like these defined a legacy more clearly than any public achievement ever could, because they revealed character under pressure, and character was the one thing no one could fake for long. Years later, people would struggle to remember the officer's name, his face, or even the exact words he had spoken, but they would remember the feeling, the shift, the quiet correction that followed. They would remember that in Harlem, disrespect met with discipline dissolved faster than anger ever could, and that a community aligned in values could reshape outcomes without violence or spectacle. And in that memory lived the true power of the story, not in what was taken, but in what was preserved: dignity, restraint, and the understanding that some smiles disappear not because they are challenged, but because they no longer belong in a place that refuses to tolerate them.
In Harlem, stories did not end the way they did in newspapers or courtrooms. They ended in memory, shaped by the way people carried them forward. Long after the officer was gone and the moment itself had faded into the background of everyday life, the meaning of what happened continued to mature, growing deeper with time rather than weaker. It became clear that the incident had never truly been about authority or insult, but about how power chose to express itself when tested, and how restraint, when practiced with intention, could alter the course of an entire community without leaving visible scars. Bumpy Johnson grew older as the years passed, and Harlem changed in ways no one could fully control, yet moments like this remained part of his quiet legacy. People who spoke of him did not always agree on his past or his role in history, but they consistently agreed on one thing: that he understood the difference between dominance and authority, and that he knew when silence could carry more weight than action. This understanding shaped how many young men approached conflict afterward, choosing patience where they once might have chosen impulse, realizing that respect earned through consistency lasted longer than fear imposed through reaction. His wife continued to live her life away from attention, never turning that moment into a symbol for herself, yet becoming one nonetheless through example alone. She showed that dignity did not require applause, and that self-respect, when held firmly, forced the world to adjust its tone. Women in Harlem spoke about her not as someone who endured disrespect, but as someone who refused to let it define her. And that distinction mattered more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Her calm response had preserved her humanity while exposing someone else's lack of it, and that lesson resonated deeply across generations. The community itself carried forward a renewed confidence, one rooted not in defiance, but in shared standards. Harlem did not become louder or more aggressive. It became clearer about what it would and would not accept. Authority figures learned to move more carefully, not because they were afraid, but because they sensed that this was a place where people remembered, where behavior had consequences even when paperwork did not, and where respect functioned as a social currency far more valuable than force. This unspoken understanding strengthened the neighborhood in ways that policies never could, creating a balance maintained through mutual awareness rather than constant confrontation. Bumpy often reflected privately on how easily the situation could have unfolded differently, how one moment of unchecked anger could have invited chaos, retaliation, or irreversible loss. He understood that choosing restraint had not only protected his family, but had also protected Harlem from becoming something it refused to be. That awareness brought him a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but certainty, the kind that comes from knowing you acted in alignment with your values rather than your emotions. For him, that alignment mattered more than winning any single moment. As the years went on, new faces replaced old ones, and Harlem continued its endless cycle of struggle and renewal. But the lesson endured beneath the surface. It reminded people that power was not proven by how quickly you could respond, but by how wisely you could wait. That dignity did not demand validation, and that silence, when chosen deliberately, could reshape outcomes more effectively than noise. The story lived on not because it was dramatic, but because it was instructive, offering a blueprint for handling disrespect without surrendering integrity. In the end, the officer's smile vanished not through confrontation or punishment, but through realization, and that made all the difference. He was not defeated by a man, a threat, or a community uprising, but by the quiet refusal of a neighborhood to engage with disrespect on its terms. Harlem did not need to raise its voice to be heard, and Bumpy did not need to act to assert his influence, because the values they upheld spoke loudly enough on their own. And that is how the story truly ends, not with triumph or tragedy, but with understanding, that the strongest responses are often the calmest, that respect defended with discipline outlasts any insult, and that real power is revealed not in moments of reaction, but in the courage to remain composed when the world expects you to explode.